MSW Media.
The rule of law is not just some lawyer's turn of phrase. It is the very foundation of our democracy. The essence of the rule of law is that like cases are treated alike. That there not be one rule for Democrats and another for Republicans, one rule for the powerful, another for the powerless, one rule for the rich and another for the poor, or different rules depending upon one's race or ethnicity. To serve as Attorney General at this critical time is a calling I am honored and eager to answer.
So now it's clean up on aisle 45 time. And for a long while yet, it is going to be clean up on aisle 45.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 176 of Clean Up on Aisle 45. It's Wednesday, June 5th, 2024. I'm Pete Struck. And last week, we told you that we'd have a verdict by the time this episode aired this Wednesday.
Yep. And hey, Pete, I'm Allison Gill. And at 4:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Thursday, May 31st, 2024, we got the verdict. Guilty on all 34 felony counts of falsification of business records. Pete, where were you when the verdict happened?
I was driving into downtown D.C. to meet some friends for dinner. I had figured, Thursday was probably a safe day because probably not going to come out until Friday, maybe even after the weekend. And after, kind of hearing the rumbling that it wasn't clear, and we'll talk about what was going on, hopped in the car and was driving down. I literally had driven past going to like the Farragut Square area. So coming in for Virginia, you can come in 66 and go over the bridge that puts you on E Street, and it dumps you out right in front of the old executive office building, and you have to turn left or right. You used to be able to go through back in the old days. So anyway, I turned left to head north. I'm past the Eisenhower office building, or the old executive office building. And just as I was doing that, I had on MSNBC, and I think it was Ari Melber, and we had known, right, that it came in as I was driving in, that we had a verdict. But then it took a while, and we'll talk about how that unfolded, but then pulled over the side of the road in front of the new executive office building, which is across the street from the old executive office building. And by the way, if you ever get to like going on a tour, the OEOB Eisenhower office building is amazingly beautiful. Like they have stained glass designed, like Art Deco style, these old polished banisters on stairwells. It's just a very, like back in the day when people took a lot of pride in craftsmanship in federal buildings. It doesn't look like much from the outside, but there are parts of it inside that are lovely. But anyway, pulled off to the side of the road and sat there and listened. Where were you?
I was on my couch in my living room with cats. One of them strategically positioned on the ottoman, the other one on my lap. And we were sitting there mostly for that, for that 45-minute wait where, we heard that there was going to be a verdict. But between that time and the time that the verdict happened. And so we were all just kind of sitting there waiting. I snapped a couple pictures of my cats and put them up on Twitter, saying that, they were ready, for the verdict. And, we'll talk about all of that, a little bit later in the show, about how all of that came to be, and sort of we'll go chronologically from the time the jury started deliberating. But before we get to that, and talk about the deliberations and the verdict, let's thank some new patrons. We've got a ton of new patrons to thank this month. You make this show possible. If you want to become a patron and get these episodes ad-free, you can also, I think the $2 level, you get a whole additional bonus episode every week where we both get quite sweary. I like the bonus episode on the weekend. You'll also have VIP meet and greet ticket access to any live shows and live events and galas and things like that. And of course, you'll be able to join our every once in a while, we'll have a Zoom call Q&A. So those are pretty fun. You can join by going to patreon.com/aisle45pod. That's AISLE 45POD. So thanks this week to Camille Turner, Omega, Road Trip, Linda McPhee, Ruth C., Sarah Ottaway, Pete Strzok is fine as fuck, and G. McLean and ISO. Thank you very much. And, you can sign up with whatever name and we'll read it as long as it's, obviously not something extremely offensive. But thank you. Thank you again so much. We couldn't do this without you. All right, Pete, let's talk about the verdict heard round the world, right? As people are saying, the trial of the century. And I always say, so far. Because we're going to have more trials this century. Jury began deliberating Tuesday morning, last Tuesday, after being read about 55 pages of jury instructions, which took 1 hour and 26 minutes to get through. Now, Justice Merchan explained that during this time, that to find Trump guilty, they'd have to determine Trump's intent to falsify or cause to be falsified business records in order to impact the outcome of the 2016 election using unlawful means, by unlawful means, including violating federal election campaign law, because $130,000 is way over the limit for a donation to your campaign, falsifying the records of other New York enterprises, and mischaracterizing the nature of the payments for tax purposes. Remember, he paid twice the amount of this reimbursement grossed up for tax purposes. And so he was getting twice the write-off, and Cohen was not having to pay taxes on what he was originally owed. So we have all of that information. Took a very long time to get through. They read all the laws, the elements of the laws, etc. And then the jury, though, the judge instructed them they only had to find one of the three unlawful means. And they didn't have to be unanimous on that underlying crime. Of course, Trump world ran with this, saying that the jury doesn't have to be unanimous on a guilty verdict, which is completely untrue. They just had three different unlawful means as underlying crimes. And honestly, we may never learn this, but Pete, they probably found that he was guilty, like unanimously on all three. All of them thought that is what I would imagine. But we won't know. We don't know unless somebody comes out and writes a book about it at some point. But right now, I'm sure they're all just trying to keep quiet because of all the reports of doxing, trying to dox these jurors coming from Trump world.
Yeah, absurd. Well, Eileen Cannon sits on a request by the government to modify the terms of Trump's release and threatening FBI agents, and pushes back,
3 weeks.
Hearing on that for 3 weeks. Fucking ridiculous. Sorry, I shouldn't swear for the kids listening. I apologize. So they get the instructions, and they go back, and after 3 hours and 45 minutes of deliberation, the bell rang. Now, for those not familiar with Manhattan court, it's like an old timey. According to the reporters in the room, it's like one of the the rotary phones where you dial, and it's like that sharp sort of clanging bell, but really, really loud. And it announced the delivery of a note from the jury. And the jury asked to rehear 4 pieces of testimony. The first was Pecker's testimony regarding his phone conversation with Trump. Now, Pecker testified he told Trump on the phone that he thought he should buy the story. Trump told Pecker, look, I'll talk to Cohen, and Cohen will get back to you. The second thing they wanted to hear was Pecker's testimony about the Trump Tower meeting between Cohen, Pecker, and Trump, where the conspiracy was first hatched, the sort of genesis of all of this. The third item they wanted to hear was Cohen's testimony about the Trump Tower meeting. And the final item was Pecker's testimony about the decision not to pay for Karen McDougal's story. And that was because lawyers from AMI told him it would be a campaign finance violation. So kind of relevant to what the jury was considering in the alleged crime.
Yeah, that unlawful means. I mean, we could have, we had 2 lawyers on this jury. We might have had a lawyer back there saying, hey, can we at least all agree that there was a campaign finance violation? Let's ask for the testimony. Again, I'm reading tea leaves. But when this note came out, I was like, this is not good for Donald Trump, because most of all of that was what was pointed out by the DA's office in their summation, in their closing arguments, like lined right up with what they really wanted to drive home with the jury. And so that seemed like pretty bad news. This note seemed like pretty bad news for Donald Trump. But then, Pete, 45 minutes later, before, they got the testimony they wanted, and the lawyers, because the lawyers were still hashing out what pages of the testimony the clerk would reread to the jury, 45 minutes later, the bell rang again. And the jury sent another note saying they want to rehear the jury instructions. Now, Justice Merchan asked the jurors if they wanted to hear all of the jury instructions again. This was at the end of the day. And he said, you don't have to answer that question right now. We can do it in the morning. And honestly, I tweeted out, Pete, I was like, this is going to be important. If they want all the jury instructions, then this is informational. But if they only want parts of the jury instructions, then they're confirming something. And if it's that kind of goes hand in hand with those 4 pieces of testimony. And they'd only been deliberating for about 4.5 hours at this point. But it sounded to me like they went in and they said, yeah, and let's even just pick one of the 3 unlawful means. And if we find that that's true and there was intent to do that, it's guilty down the board. And so I think that they went back and wanted to confirm all that information. That's why they asked for the jury. Well, we didn't know until the next morning, right? Because when they got there in the morning, we found out that the jury only wanted part of the jury instructions, pages 6 through 35. And the parts that they wanted were the parts about intent or what the jury can infer from the evidence. And so we heard again the scenario that now I think it's one of the best ways to describe this I've heard, where the judge said, look, if you wake up in the morning, it's not raining, but the sidewalks are wet and people are holding umbrellas, you can infer that it has rained. And that I think is a big part of this.
Right. And what's really interesting is that's one of your first year in law school that you get as, most attorneys, every attorney will know what inferential evidence is and can, and almost always will use that example, right, of it had been raining, it is not raining now, but you can infer that it was, and you can do the same thing with the evidence. So I'm really curious with 2 attorneys on that jury, they know exactly what inferential evidence is, which you can infer from the evidence. And I'm curious if they said, you know what, to the extent people were wondering about that, to the extent they said, hey, let's just, you can do that, but let the judge tell you, have them read that back, because it's a very powerful concept. And again, I think one of those, to your point, I agree, when you're asking very minute things like that, I think from the time they asked for those 4 elements of the evidence to be read back, it was clear that it was, none of these things were good news for Trump and for the defense.
Right. But I was still nervous. I was still nervous in that 45 minutes. And we'll talk about the verdict after the break. But, I'm with you on these jury notes. I think that they were really bad for Donald Trump. I know we were all tweeting that. I know George Conway was tweeting it. Everyone was kind of like, why? Tell us why. It's bad for him. And I think that you explained it really well. And I have a question for you. I don't know. Maybe somebody can answer this question. Are juries ever because it feels like either one of 2 things happened. They went back there. They talked for three hours or so. Maybe the foreman was like, look, we need 1 piece of unlawful means. Let's use this. Let's ask for this testimony to confirm it. And let's ask for the jury instructions about it to confirm it. But we seem to be all on the same page. I don't think that anybody was trying to change anybody's mind in the jury room. But does this ever happen where the jury gets back there and they're like, we should probably do something and take a while so that it doesn't look like we just all pre-thought he was guilty already. Do you know what I mean? Like if it takes too short of a period of time, I don't know. Yeah,
look, I mean, I think that again, I've never been in a jury. I've always, those times I've been called for jury duty, almost immediately been not laughed at, but said, oh no, thank you, Mr. FBI agent. You can leave.
Right.
Surprisingly enough. But, we don't know what happened behind closed doors. I think in this case, they're going to I think they were taking things very seriously. I am curious, like how much, was there general agreement? And I think, every indication was from this jury, the way they comported themselves, from their demeanor and the way the press was talking about them, nobody was kind of goofing around. There was couple of commentators mentioned that there was one juror that they were worried kind of would smirk or stare off into space. But when it came time for Merchant to read the instructions, they were all locked in. They were all taking notes. And by all accounts, they were taking their civic duty very, very seriously, as we would hope, as I would hope me and you and every listener of this program, in fact, every citizen of the United States would treat it with the same seriousness. So my sense is, there was a legitimate reason for asking, whether that was because there were a couple of people who weren't sure, or whether they just wanted kind of as a collective to make sure they understood it the right way. Who knows? Again, my advice to all the jurors would be not to say a word to anyone until, this is long past. If you want to write a memoir, write it, but then shop it around after, the crazy MAGA land isn't going to try and, follow up on these, demonstrated threats. Right after this verdict, and we will talk about some later, there were calls for these people to be doxxed and, attacked and tracked down and identified. So it's a very hostile environment that the convicted felon Donald Trump has created. But we won't know. We may never know, but I suspect, this is such a huge deal. I would think and hope that at some point when it is a safer environment that we will hear some of the stories from the jury, because it's a momentous thing. And I hope and I expect that the story I think will come out is that we took this as seriously as anything in our lives, because it was.
Yeah. And maybe they could do it anonymously. Speak to somebody off the record. I know my DMs are open. You can always talk to me off the record, but it is a very dangerous environment. Miles Taylor wrote his book and his anonymous op-ed, the famous Lodestar op-ed in the Washington Post, and then his book, A Warning. He did that and pretty successfully, anonymously. But yeah, I'm dying to know more, but not at the expense of the safety of these men and women who did their civic duty. All right, we're going to talk more about this. We're going to pick this up on Thursday morning when the jury came back and got their stuff read to them. But we have to take a quick break. Everybody stick around. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. We have more new amazing patrons to thank, including Quacker, Susan Callahan, Stephanie Long, Joanna DuPont, Chris Chapin, Chopper the Rebel Droid is my political compass, T. Earl Grey Hot, do love some Earl Grey tea, and Florian Wagner. Thank all of you so much. You truly are heroes to me, to Allison. You make all of this possible, and so thank you for being able to bring this to you, to go through all of the things going on, to talk about this truly momentous week in American history. Couldn't do it without you. So with that, we're up to Thursday morning.
So true.
Thursday morning, and the lawyers had stayed late the night before, coming to agreement on what pages of testimony would be reread to the jury. And then everyone came in at 9:30 a.m., and that's when we learned the jury only wanted to hear a portion of the jury instructions. The jury was read everything, and then they went back to deliberations. Well, let's talk about why they didn't have a copy of the jury instructions to begin with, because, you talked about, Allison, how long these were, right? 55 pages taking an hour and a half. It's like, why not? Nobody can remember that. Why not just give them a copy? And of course, Trump world is trying to portray this as they're a victim of something because the jury doesn't have a copy of the jury instructions. It's a cover up. It's a sham. They're trying to pull one over on them. Well, this is from the New York court's website talking about jury instructions. Quote, "The submission of a written jury charge could be a very significant aid to jury comprehension. Carefully designed procedures could adequately protect the defendant against the danger of prejudice that may arise in any written jury submission." And this cites Susan R. Schwager, the submission of written instructions in statutory language to New York criminal juries, 56 Brooklyn L. Reb 1353, 1380, Winter 1991. Apologies if my legal citation style is horrible, because I do not have training on how to read legal citation. But continuing on, thus far, the Court of Appeals has held that it is error to provide a deliberating jury with a written copy of a complete final charge or portions thereof over a defendant's objection. And again, two citations, People v. Johnson and People v. Owens. A defendant may, however, consent, or impliedly consent by failing to timely object to the submission of a written copy of the court's entire final instructions to the jury. People v. Muhammad. If the court does provide a copy of its written final instructions, it needs to instruct the jury on the use of the written instructions. And the following model is thus provided. So it's clear that, actually there is a provision, in general, New York law has held that it's error to provide a written copy of the charge unless the defendant concurs. And, clearly in this case, I don't know that that the state even asked Trump if they assumed he would say no, or if they just said, you know what, let's just read it. But I mean, there's a little doubt in my mind that Trump would say, oh, yeah, sure, go ahead. I mean, but the point is all this whining and crying and complaining about it's not fair and they couldn't have it. It's like, well, no, if you're willing to waive that, then they can have it.
Mm-hmm. And it's the rule. The default is no, you don't get
Right.
it. Thanks for that. And yeah, that's right off the New York court's website, as pointed out by some folks on Twitter for us. So that was very helpful. So I thank them for posting that. Yeah, thanks for reading those. We grabbed that off of the New York court's website. It was shared by Periodic Tweet on Twitter. That's the name of the person who shared it, and the link to this document, that it's right there in black and white. So thanks a lot. And thanks to Periodic Tweet for sharing it. All right, let's talk about the deliberations, because we were told, Pete, I was under the impression from somewhere, maybe it was Kyle Cheney, some reporter in the pool, said that they were going to deliberate until 6 p.m. Eastern on Thursday. But at 4:30, everyone was like, oh, a judge is coming in, everybody go to the courtroom. So everybody kind of filed into the courtroom, filed into the overflow room. Judge Merchan entered the courtroom and basically told the parties he was going to, excuse me, I'm going to go tell the jury that they can go home for the day. Now, several reporters tweeted out, no verdict today, sending the jury home. I think I even retweeted something. Nope, today's not the day. And I was actually super excited because I had Friday for the verdict in the office pool. So I was like, all right, cool. Yeah, that's definitely going to be Friday. But when Judge Merchan returned to the courtroom, he had a note with him. And at 4:20 p.m., 4:20, nice. He read the note. We, the jury.
Wait, I don't understand. Yeah, no, I understand. I understand.
Sure, cop. You have to tell me you're a cop.
Uh-huh.
We, the jury, have reached a verdict, is the note. And then he explained that the jury just needed about 30 minutes to fill out the verdict form. So like I said, we all sat there. I had a cat on my lap. We all sat there for 45 minutes just waiting. And we knew at that point that there wasn't a hung jury, which was our worst fear, right? If you're hoping for a conviction of Donald Trump. Because that means it's a unanimous acquittal or a number of unanimous convictions between 1 and 34. And even though I was 100% sure, Pete, I was 100% sure, and we've talked about this last week, there's no way they're going to unanimously acquit Donald Trump with the evidence. I was still nervous about what the verdict was going to be.
Yeah. And I'm sure my phone was blowing up, texts were blowing up, like everybody, talking about it. And I was the same. I mean, there was no way it was an acquittal. The question in my mind was, there was some debate about, do they split with these sort of like underlying acts? Do they find him guilty on the checks he signed himself, but maybe not the others, and kind of like split the baby? But it was, I was convinced. I was with you. I'm like, okay, they're going to go home. Like, even if they knew today, right? Even if on Thursday, like, yeah, we're all kind of there, straw poll, we're all unanimous, we're there. Like, let's go home and sleep on it. Make sure we're right? Because we want to get this right. And then come in, get your free lunch.
And you get another free lunch.
Exactly. Say, we want Indian or Chinese or whatever, get like a nice court lunch or whatever their options are, and then deliver the verdict at 2 p.m. or something. So that's what I thought too. And particularly following everybody saying, yep, Merchan's going to send him home for the day. It's like, all right, well, it's early, fine. We'll set this up and maybe we get something before lunch tomorrow. But, or in the horrible of horribles, we go into next week and we're in bad shape. But, it was there. And then that 30 minutes took a good 45, felt like an hour or more. But that And then I was sitting there, and I think I had the radio on MSNBC, and it was Ari Melber going through and reading out the counts. And it was interesting because it was on, I think they have something where like their correspondents will give them the feed before they post it on social media. And plus I heard like the internet Wi-Fi was notorious, and between that and like the cell phone data coverage, like everybody trying to use the data all at once was just grinding things to a halt. And it probably has like the old, 1400 baud or 1440 dial-up modem that they're using to give everybody internet access. But it was slow, but and just count after count after count. And I didn't have like a charge sheet in front of me to see which was which, but it was like, and they came in like groups of 5, and it was like,
he was
guilty,
reading them
guilty,
like counts
guilty,
1 through 5 guilty, 6 guilty, 7 guilty, through 12
and then all the way,
guilty.
and you're up to 30, and it's like, okay, how many counts again? Because we're almost to the end here, and he's guilty of all of them, and then 34 guilty, and that was
all 34. Yeah. And I think what was really interesting is Fox News, I don't know if this had to be just a tactical error, because they were feeding the same feed that Ari was getting. One of the Fox News reporters was getting outside the courthouse. And so Fox had cameras on her outside the courthouse as she was reading what Ari was reading. And behind her, crowds are erupting in cheers as she says guilty. Because in the MSNBC studio, it's quiet, right?
I would have liked to have seen that. Yeah, it was just Ari reading counts. There was no. It's
just quiet.
Fox distinguished themselves, by the way. But they had like Trey Gowdy on earlier in the week, and they're on the street, and some guy zips by on, I don't know if he was on a bike or skateboard or what, but like perfectly timed the shot. So he goes behind and screaming, "F you, Trey Gowdy." I mean, Fox was just could not have done a more chef's kiss job of giving New York flavor to their coverage.
Yep, it was great. I appreciated it. And I only saw it on social media afterwards, because I was also watching MSNBC when the verdict came in. So sentencing is July 11th. That's 4 days before the Republican National Convention, Pete, in Milwaukee. And I'll be in Milwaukee live that week after that, by the way. So do you think, now during the press conference after the verdict, Alvin Bragg gave a press conference, very good press conference, just said, the rule of law has prevailed, basically. And he was asked if he was going to recommend jail time for Donald Trump. And he said, you'll find out when I write up my sentencing recommendations. He wouldn't answer the question at that time. There's a lot of mitigating factors here, right? This isn't a normal, like I was having a hard time finding out what other white-collar criminals guilty of this same offense spent in jail. I tried to look up those cases, but 99.9% of the time, people plead to misdemeanors and avoid jail time, but not Trump. Like I didn't see anybody, unless they were charged with a ton of other crimes, and this was more ancillary. I never really saw anybody that didn't just plead out and pay a small fine, or, whatever, do 2 years of probation, 5 years of probation, or something like that. So I don't really have a measuring stick for this, but given that I would normally say there would probably be no jail time for anything like this, but given his lack of remorse, something that, just Judge Engoron said was pathological, maybe, and his contemptuous behavior may be different. Maybe this will be different.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be very interesting for me to see, one, what the government recommends, and two, what the court decides to do, because it is, there are a lot of things that you said ordinarily this would not result in, first-time offender criminally, not civilly for sure, but advanced age, running for the president, he's going to get a little bit of a presumption of like, well, he's the presumptive nominee or about to be the nominee. And oh, by the way, all this complaint about is getting in the way of him in the convention. You know who said that date would be fine and asked for a particular set of dates? Trump's attorneys did. So don't all this BS out there about, oh, they're trying to mess with him in the Republican National Convention. The court asked them, what dates would you like that won't interfere with other things? And they said, oh, hey, mid-month or the dates they gave, but it was entirely in line with this. But it is, so you've got these things that say, well, maybe you shouldn't get time. But what judges also consider is, to what extent does the person accept responsibility for their crime? To what extent do they express remorse for what they've done? And Trump not only has not accepted any responsibility. I don't take any responsibility at all. Not has he not only shown no remorse, he's been like aggressively whining and complaining about how unjust and unfair and a witch hunt and not. So it's not just like neutral. I'm not going to accept responsibility.
It's like the opposite.
It's aggressively poking the justice system. Society has decided this is the law that we're going to hold everybody to and make sure you behave that way. And if you don't, we're going to use the coercive power of the state to punish you if you're found guilty in our system. And you punish somebody, one, to show them, you've done this wrong and to change future behavior, but then also to serve as a deterrent effect for the community. And in this case, very relevant for Trump is you want to do something sufficient to both, tell him and show him it was wrong and prevent future bad behavior on his part. And that was the whole thing about, the amount of money that Eugene too, right? Like what amount of money is going to get Donald Trump to shut up and stop defaming Eugene? It has to be high because he just isn't going to care if it's $500,000 or $2 million. And so there is, I think, a strong argument to the court. If you want to tell this person who is not only utterly unremorseful, but actively decrying the fairness of the judicial process, actively undermining and undercutting the decision of 12 random New York citizens who listened to the evidence, who listened to the cross-examinations and challenges to that evidence, and unanimously decided 34 times that Donald Trump committed a felony. How do you let somebody like that walk away with just like, I'm going to give you probation? And some people have said, give him $200 of community service where he has to go pick up trash on the side of the highway and get his hands dirty, or he needs to go to jail, period, in my opinion.
I think so too. I tend to think that the DA may recommend some jail time. I don't know if Mershon will sentence him to jail. I know he was loath to put him in jail for his contempt, but that may have been because it would slow the proceedings and cause more of a circus. But it's hard. I think it's hard for me to tell which way he'll lean. I do think he may be able to stay out of jail. Let's say the DA recommends some amount of jail, 4 months or something, 6 months of jail, and the Justice Mershon agrees and sentences him to 4 months or whatever. I think that we probably would see him be able to stay out of jail pending an appeal of the conviction, much like Bannon did with the federal court, who still isn't in jail. I don't understand why he's not in jail. I think there's ridiculous some sort of hearing on June 6th or something. We'll find out if he walks out and goes right to jail. But I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what Judge Mershon does. We'll see what the DA recommends. And then, again, he may be able to stay out of jail pending his appeal.
Yeah, and this, look, it wouldn't be hard to do. And I mean, there's been some reporting, which I believe that the Secret Service has already talked with New York authorities about what incarceration would look like. It isn't hard. I mean, there are any number of ways you could do it. He's not going to go in general population, right? And he's not going to go into some isolation cell in Rikers. I can see it being, I think it was Director Comey was on Jen Psaki, I think. It was like, look, you just get a double wide and stick it in a corner of the prison yard where he and the Secret Service can live. It's separated from everybody else. He can eat there. He can live there and, just do the time there. It would be very safe. And it's not, the cost of a double wide is not like, oh, we have to build a whole new facility. No, you don't. No, you don't. Just get, it probably wouldn't be even my preference as some nasty urine-stained, carpeted, ex-meth heads, double wide. Instead, it'd probably be something, comparatively nice, but it's not hard.
He could stay in Clarence Thomas's motor coach.
Yeah, yes. He could get Harlan Crow to spring for, a motorhome, a home away from home.
Clarence Thomas, I'll lend you my RV.
In the yard,
Mr. President.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for that lovely picture in my head of urine-stained, double-wide meth cooking trailers. Thank you. But we have more stories. We have more news than just the verdict that happened this week that I want to talk about. And then also I have one more. Before we get into the other updates, I have one more question about the trial and your thoughts on it. But we do have to take another quick break. So everybody stick around. We'll be right back. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. We have some more new patrons to thank, including Bako_Chad, Susan Rothbauer, Matt or Matthew, either works, Bill Lumberg, Eyal or Ayal, Patrick Coe, Perry Penderson, and Jenny Doe. Thank you so much for supporting independent journalism. Really, you make everything possible. We couldn't do it without you. So thank you. Thank you. All right. So one quick question before, I think during the break, you had mentioned that you have something else you wanted to tell me.
Yeah, every new agent, particularly those who don't come from law enforcement backgrounds, right? And I'd say like in our new agent class, it was pretty typical. Probably a quarter, it was 50-ish people, and probably a quarter of them came from law enforcement backgrounds, whether state police, city police, sheriff's department, whatever it was. They had, done this sort of thing day in, day out. But for the other 3/4 of us, like having never like gone through responding to a domestic violence incident or something where you're like meeting people who are not necessarily logical, rational, don't want to be meeting with an FBI agent, or potentially dangerous. They create down at Quantico something called Hogan's Alley. It's like a little town that has a bank, and it has a theater, and it has a drugstore, and it has an apartment complex, and it has trailers. It has lots of double wides. And one of the things that they do is there is a lot of training about going in to arrest somebody. And sometimes they're compliant, sometimes they're not compliant. Frequently they'll split you up in teams, and they use what's called simunition, which is like a paintball gun, but it's like really tiny little paint pellets that hurt like hell when they hit you, but like you can tell if you're hit or not. But the point is, what it's trying to do is teach you, one, to be safe, two, to safely, if you need to use deadly force, when that is, to be able to understand like when that, that Eileen Cannon's, complete contempt for the misstatement of the FBI's deadly force policy by Trump's attorneys down in the Mar-a-Lago case, but to go through all of those things when you're on your feet, when weird things are happening, when violent things are happening, so that you, if God forbid you ever have to use your service weapon, that you use it in accordance with the policy, and you use it legally, and you only use it when necessary. So therefore, like ask any FBI agent, they will tell you about double wides down at Quantico and all the shit that can go wrong. Sorry, I'm swearing too much. All the things that are horrible, that you assume somebody's safe, and they're just kind of leaning on the side of a little doorway in the double wide, and it turns out they've got a gun taped on the other side of the little thing they're leaning for, and you let your guard down for a second, they pull the gun down and they shoot you. I mean, double wides have a special place in my memory for whatever that was, 1998. And then they have, follow-on sessions. Like they have something called the Firearms Training Simulator, or FATS, or they used to, I don't know what it's called now, where it's essentially like this big screen TV video game where you've got a weapon out and you run through these scenarios, and, it's like shoot, don't shoot sort of questions. And whatever you do, you have to sit there, and the instructor will sit there and say, okay, what did you do? Why did you do it? And you have to articulate what you did or didn't do. And so anyway, double wides are a thing. And again,
and burned into your memory.
Yeah. And for the funny thing is, like, again, for all those, for the quarter of the people who are former law enforcement officers, for our listeners who were former law enforcement officers, they're like, come on, FBI guy. Like, you really come, the funny thing is, like, the inside baseball is like, if you look at the job of what a local police officer does, the amount of like threat of violence and actual violence that they encounter over the course of their career is way, 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 way higher and more frequent than what an average FBI agent encounters. And so for them, it's, it was like no big deal, but I mean, it was important training. But anyway, sorry, I wanted to take my little, why does Pete care so much about double wide trailers and urine stained meth cooking houses?
No, I think I love the inside baseball. Thank you. That's why it's great that we have you as a co-host on this show. Would never get that kind of information anywhere else. So appreciate it. But I did have one question for you about the verdict. I was talking to, I'm in Chicago. We did a live show at Chicago, Shuba's Tavern, with Renato Mariotti, and I was talking to him. It really felt like, because Renato said this actually was the one of the 4 cases that Trump had any outside shot of perhaps winning. But my follow on to that was, I think that they lost it more than the DA won it. What were your thoughts about that?
That's a good question. I firmly believe Trump did himself no favors. I think it was likely Trump who said, call Costello. I'm surprised, and I'm not surprised that Trump did not testify. I think that was the right call. But I think some of the things they did where, this long, just labored cross-examination of Michael Cohen for hours and hours and hours didn't really help them. But it was a good case. The evidence was clear. Right? The evidence was good. And so I don't know.
The DA brought a really good case.
Yeah. Did Trump lose it? No. Did he help himself? No, he didn't. But I don't know that there was any sort of like help he actually could have given that would overcome the evidence that was there. And it is kind of a parallel observation to that. And a little bit coming out. And George Conway has been saying a bit about this over the past few days as we're taping. I'm not at all surprised that Fox continually said there's no case here. I'm not really surprised that MSNBC said, this is a pretty decent case. I am really surprised that CNN in particular, the times I tuned in, they were like, especially after Cohen, oh boy, this could be it. This could be, an acquittal. They were very, in my opinion, sort of pessimistic about their view of the evidence and the prospects of a conviction and the seriousness of their charges. And I don't know. I don't get it. I do worry sometimes if there's a little like trying too hard to like attract the both sides of the debate and get more conservative, undecided voters if they can't just be straight. It's like, this isn't a question of being liberal or conservative. This is a question of just telling the truth. And that should be the only consideration. But that was CNN's coverage of this trial was weird to me.
And I remember, there was something I think that happened yesterday. Ellie Honig had written a piece saying how unconstitutional and terrible it was for the DA to spring the unlawful means on us right before closing arguments. And I didn't really understand what he was talking about because, I've been posting the unlawful means language from the filing last November. Which was approved to be used by the judge this past February. So there was nothing last minute about it. So it's just very confusing to me what's going on over there as well. We have some very interesting news I wanted to ask you about coming out of Detroit News is the name of the publication. This is from Craig Mauger and Melissa Nan Burke. I hope I'm pronouncing those names right. Testimony in Michigan court Friday revealed that both state and federal investigators continue to probe certificates that falsely claimed Donald Trump won the 2020 election, 5 months ahead of the next election. On the fourth day of preliminary examinations for 6 of the Republicans whose names appeared on the false certificate in Michigan, Captain Darren Green of the Michigan State Police said he had been interviewed this past Thursday, by someone from the FBI and 2 U.S. prosecutors from Washington, D.C. Now, Green was at the Michigan Capitol when the group of fraudulent electors tried to enter the building on December 14th, remember, to present their document to the Michigan Senate. Green said the interview Thursday focused on the electors. Now, just before Green's remarks, Howard Schock, an agent of Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel's office, testified he had outstanding subpoenas or search warrants for information as part of an ongoing state investigation into the fraudulent electors. It's still an open investigation, he said. And for the second time in 2 months, he said Trump was considered an unindicted co-conspirator, but as of now, there wasn't enough evidence to recommend charges against Trump. He's part of the investigation, but he hasn't been charged with a crime yet. That's what he said.
Yeah, and so the comments from both Green and Schock came on the fourth day of preliminary examinations in Ingham County District Court, which is where Lansing, the Michigan capital, is, for 6 of the Republican electors whose signatures appeared on the false certificate declaring Trump the winner of Michigan after a closed-door meeting inside Michigan GOP headquarters on December 14th, 2020. Back in July, Nessel's office announced forgery charges against the 16 Republicans who signed the document, which was later used by Trump's campaign in an attempt to overturn the former president's loss to Democrat Joe Biden when Congress met to count electoral votes on January 6. The statements in court on Friday and Nessel's remarks in an interview earlier in this week point to investigations into the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election that are rolling on with about 5 months before the 2024 presidential election. In an interview with the Detroit News on Wednesday, Nessel, Michigan's top law enforcement official and an absolute rock star, that is my commentary, not the Detroit News commentary, was asked if she was investigating Trump. Nessel said her office hasn't, quote, foreclosed any future investigations, any future potential defendants. She continues, you don't just get to accept the winner of an election only if it was your candidate, if it was your choice. And I think it's a very dangerous precedent, added Nessel, a Democrat. Continuing, I'm concerned that it's taking so long for any of these cases involving the 2020 election to get to a point where we're actually seeing criminal trials. We charged these cases, about a year ago, and we're not even completed any of the exams. Now, the preliminary exams for 6 of the 16 GOP electors are ongoing in Ingham County District Court before Judge Kristen Simmons. The exams for 6 other electors concluded in April, but there's been no decision on whether prosecutors have presented enough evidence for the cases to go to trial. 3 more Trump electors will apparently have their exams at a later date. The 16th, James Renner of Lansing, has reached a cooperation deal with the Attorney General's office. Defense lawyers in the false electors cases have contended that their clients were acting on legal advice from GOP lawyers, and the prosecutors haven't produced evidence to prove their clients committed a forgery, a crime that requires someone to have an intent to defraud. So
I'm 100% sure that Dana Nessel has evidence of intent. She wouldn't have brought charges if she didn't have that evidence. But interesting, 2 U.S. prosecutors from D.C. and FBI agents interviewing this cop, right? The cop that basically, I think he's the cop that told the Michigan electors that they couldn't go inside the state house because they didn't win. And the Democrats were in there signing their certificate because I think the law in Michigan says you have to sign your certification of your electors in the state house. If I'm incorrect on any of that, please write in, let us know. But yeah, it's very, very interesting to me. Like it's DC, right? So it's got to be either the DC U.S. attorney or Jack Smith.
Yeah. And and we talked about some of this, when that story broke. And I find it hard to see how, I don't think this is just the DC U.S. Attorney's Office doing they're like, hey, we're cutting the state electoral fraud, federal aspects to you. I think it is either they are working in conjunction with Jack Smith's office or it is Jack Smith's folks, because I don't see how you decouple what state actors were doing, because they're clearly looking at the national effort, right? I mean, when you look at co-conspirator 1 through 6, many of those co-conspirators were involved with the plans that were undertaken in Georgia and Michigan and Arizona and all around. So you had a national infrastructure that was pushing that forward. I mean, that was Eastman. There were a number of people who caused that to be. So if you're Jack Smith, I think it is very appropriate that you look at those higher level folks, because they're the ones like, how much was Trump aware of it? Did Trump direct it? Did Trump tacitly okay it? When you want to understand how this took place from a national perspective, the states aren't going to be able to do that the same way the feds can, because they're only looking at the state impact. And I don't know how, if you say, okay, well, they're looking at those higher level individuals. If you're then, though, looking and saying, okay, but they had these contact with these state electors, they had this contact with these state GOP officials, you still want to know what they said. You still want to have some ability to impact, okay, before we cut a cooperation agreement with some, state GOP official, we got to make sure it's, worth it for what we're going to get out of him or her about Eastman or about Sidney Powell or whoever it was. So I don't easily envision a scenario where Jack Smith just said, cut this loose. We're not interested in it. And then the question is, okay, well, it's June of 2024. We've all kind of known about this since January of 2021. So what the hell's going on?
Maybe it's some sort of those little confirmation witnesses they like to get when they're prepping their case or whatever. I don't know. They're like, hey, it would be great if we got that cop, to test it, because in order to get the evidence of the certificate in, we need somebody to lay the foundation that they were turned away from the state house or something, I don't know, but none of the co-conspirators in the January 6th case for the fraudulent elector scheme against Trump have been indicted. So it's just Trump at this point, right? And whether it's either, at first I was like, it's got to be because for speed, right? You don't want to indict all these other people who then consolidate the case and push everything back into 2 years from now.
Right. Do what happened in
But
Georgia.
also, maybe they're just still investigating.
Yeah, I think both. I mean, and look, I think it's a very reasonable question. I think it is a question we'll have an answer to. I mean, assuming Trump doesn't get reelected and bury the report, or he doesn't even get a report after he disbands Jack Smith. But I'm nearly metaphysically certain that this is something that they decided early on, that what is the scope of what we're going to do, and what order do we want to do this? Do we want to focus on getting a charge against Trump and keeping it simple and get all the evidence we need for that? And we'll look into these other things later on, doing it, seriatim versus doing it all at once on parallel tracks. I again, based on my
it's kind of like what Mueller did.
Yeah, I mean, we had debate after debate after debate on the early days of Mueller about talking like how should we do these? What is the extent? Because it's the center is clear, but they're inevitably like 50 tentacles, and the question is like, how far do you go down all of these different paths? And like Bijan Rafikian and Alptikin and all these, like, I mean, there are paths, and the same thing with like Manafort, and you start looking at all the people who are enabling him, the Kochs of the world, right?
Cohen.
The bankers who are right, and Cohen, and again, Cohen, right? The whole thing came up. Well, that came up there, and the whole essential consulting payment to Stormy was a secondary thing to kind of like what else. Victor Vexelberg was, causing payments to be made that,
right. That's what Mueller was looking into, and the Trump Tower lie, the Moscow Trump Tower lie.
So that is. Again, for a strategy perspective, that is one of the main things. Like Jack Smith has all his, prosecutorial investigative teams who are sitting there gathering evidence and doing it. But one of the main things he does is like, or should be doing, and I assume is doing because he's a bright attorney and prosecutor, is from a very 35,000 foot level saying, how do we want to generally, what path do we want to follow? How much do we want to do? What do we not want to do? And how do we want to sequence it? And it isn't just some haphazard, oh, crap, we forgot about X. I mean, so I think, and I expect and hope at some point we'll know, and there'll be, I'm sure, plenty of criticism.
And this wasn't the first idea either. The first idea, a lot of people mistakenly think the first idea was a bottom-up investigation from the boots on the ground all the way up to the top and however long it took. But that actually wasn't the first thing. The first thing that, Cooney wanted to tell Garland and that Garland was in on and they wanted to do was investigate the ties between the White House, the Willard, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, Roger Stone, and that group of people. Like that's how they started initially. And that's March of 2020. That's the week that Merrick Garland got there. That's the way that they wanted to start this investigation. And they went down that road for several months and then found it to be a nowhere road and changed their tact.
Yeah, and depending on who you talk to, encountered some depending on who you talk to, encountered some resistance within the FBI. And again, something I hope, that's why we have an IG, and given the vigor with which the IG looked at everything that was done with Hillary Clinton and the Crossfire Hurricane investigations, I would hope the IG would, again, as I've said before on this program, if he expends a tenth of the effort into how the early days of the post-January 6th investigations, what was done and not done and why, the U.S. public would be well served understanding all the factors that went into all those decisions. I'm not holding my breath.
I don't see that happening.
No, he doesn't have. There's no Democrat Chuck Grassley, threatening, the fires of hell. You got Dick Durbin, who's like, we could hold a hearing, but it's not going to get anywhere, so we're not going to.
They'll just write a letter.
Yeah, write a letter.
Just write another letter.
Hey, everybody, it's AG. I'm on a plane right now, but I have some breaking news. Wisconsin Attorney General Josh Kaul has indicted Ken Chesebro, Mike Roman, and Jim Troupis with a Class H felony of conspiracy related to the fraudulent electors scheme. They face up to 6 years in prison each, and Pete and I are going to go over the 47-page indictment in detail on next week's Cleanup on Aisle 45. This has been breaking news.
All right, we have a couple more updates, and they're good ones, but we have to take a quick break, so stick around. We'll be right back.
Hey, welcome back. Our final list of new patrons to thank includes Mike Pasick, or Pasick, K.E., Ani Sakyan Peck, Kiki Fabulous, Greg Lynn, Don and Ann are happy to be here. And again, Don and Ann, I'm certain you're very nice people. I hear Don and Ann being happy to be here, and I think of Don Heathfield and Ann Foley, the two Russian illegals in Boston, but I do not want to insult you at all. I do not want to insult you at all by associating you with them, but those two names, that's all I think of. Anyway, Don and Ann are happy to be here. Thank you so much. Brooke Thorson and former right-wing jail clerk, I got better. Thank all of you for your support. Again, that's it is humbling every week seeing the new folks supporting what we're doing and becoming part of the community and part of the team. And thank all of you so much and allowing us to do things like bringing you a Rudy Giuliani update.
Ooh.
This is from Alexandra Marquez at NBC. The DC Bar's Board on Professional Responsibility on Friday recommended that Rudy Giuliani be barred from practicing law in the nation's capital. No,
we've been waiting for this decision for a long time.
Yes, we're on the Rudy horizon. We cannot escape. He cannot escape what's coming. In its report, the board cited Giuliani's work in Pennsylvania following the 2020 presidential election, in which he sought to have the state's election results thrown out in favor of his former client, Donald Trump. Quote, the board agrees with the hearing committee. The disciplinary council proved by clear and convincing evidence that respondent violated Pennsylvania rules of professional conduct, unquote, the report says, and continues, with respect to sanction, we agree with the hearing committee that respondent should be disbarred. Now, this report follows one from last year in which a disciplinary board for the D.C. Bar also recommended disbarment for Giuliani. Now the case heads to the D.C. Court of Appeals, which will decide with finality whether Giuliani, who formerly served as America's mayor of New York City, will be disbarred.
He will be. I think he will be.
Gosh, you better be. How again, if you do what Rudy did and it isn't enough to disbar you.
What do you have to do to be disbarred? If not
yes,
that, right?
Abandon hope.
Yes.
And the sad part is, like, at some point, there will be there'll be provisions of, in the future, here's what you have to do to be readmitted to the bar. It will not, I'm willing to bet it will not be a lifetime ban. Now, effectively, it may be a lifetime ban given Rudy's age and liver, but we'll
Yeah, it's only
forever.
3 years, for example, for Jenna over in Colorado, right? Because she agreed to it. So she can't practice law either. So it's a bummer, I love this for him. Next up, though, Pete from the Associated Press, relatives and victims of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting are asking a bankruptcy judge to liquidate Alex Jones's media company, including InfoWars, instead of allowing him to reorganize his business as they seek to collect on $1.5 billion in the lawsuit in verdicts against him. Lawyers for the families filed an emergency motion Sunday in U.S. bankruptcy court in Houston saying Free Speech Systems has no prospect of getting a reorganization plan approved by the court and has, quote, failed to demonstrate any hope of beginning to satisfy their legal claims, which relate to Jones's calling the 2012 school shooting a hoax. A hearing in Free Speech Systems' bankruptcy case was scheduled for Monday related to the dispute over the company's finances. Jones went on his web and radio show. You may have seen clips of this. I have shared it. It's gone viral over the weekend, saying there was a conspiracy against him and he has to sell his ranch. And he expected InfoWars to be shut down in a month or two because of the family's bankruptcy court filings. The comment included profanity-laden rants, and Jones cried at some points. There's really no avenue out of this, he said on his show Sunday. I'm kind of in a bunker here. And don't worry, I'll come back. The enemy can't help but do this attack. So we've covered this story in more detail on the Daily Beans yesterday, but I really wanted to just get your thoughts on Mr. Alex Jones.
It makes my blood boil because, again, for those, I think people forget just how horrendous what took place in Sandy Hook was. I mean, December 2012, so almost 12 years, these poor families waiting still for some sort of justice while Alex Jones continues to run his mouth in the most inflammatory way, taking part allegedly in an insurrection against our nation. But 20 children between the ages of 6 and 7 were killed, along with 6 adults. 20 6 and 7-year-olds massacred. And Alex Jones taking to the airwaves, taking to social media, saying things like it was a false flag or, otherwise casting doubt about what occurred. And for these families, the unspeakable tragedy of having to process the loss of a child, the loss of so many children in the community, brothers, sisters, grandchildren, what have you, for this just repugnant human being to go on and on and on for going on 12 years now without some measure of, and a huge judgment that was found in favor of the families years ago. Let's find some finality here. Get this, just put this to an end. And I just, and it's all, in my opinion, performance art for Alex Jones, because he knows people aren't going to tune in for the whole show.
Kyle Rittenhouse moment.
Yes, he's on like a little loop. I'm going to laugh. I'm going to cry. I'm going to shout. And then, okay, for the 6 p.m. viewers, I'm going to laugh. I'm going to cry. I'm going to shout. And buy my supplements, and you can chip in. And it's all grift. All of it. All of it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to, he was even saying something about how horrible this is for our kids to have to live in this kind of society. He actually was talking about children, which again, absolutely, like you said, makes my blood boil because of the pain that he caused the families and the relatives of the victims of the Sandy Hook shooting. Absolutely, 1.5 billion isn't enough, but he shouldn't have a penny to his name. Everything he owns should be going to these victims, these families, and the victims' families. Every penny. That's what the punishment is. That's what you get for doing what you did. So stop fighting it. Sell your shit. Maybe the court will do an emergency liquidation of InfoWars. That would be, again, I love that for them. Anyway, thank you everybody for signing up to be patrons. It's incredible. And everybody else who is listening, just the mere act of listening to this show helps us out, and we love it. So thank you so much. I love this community. It's so cool. I just did a great live show in Chicago with a bunch of listeners, and everybody wanted me to tell you hello, Pete. They were wondering where you were. I was like, he's probably at home with the
Amazing.
dog.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you.
But
Thank you.
Really
yeah,
fun.
And I love listeners and patrons. I'm blown away every single time we have a Zoom happy hour, every single time we've had in-person event. We've got another one coming up this summer, I think, right? In August, maybe. You're just
we have a
the
live
most
show
amazing
in
group
DC
of people.
Hamilton, yeah.
And folks who write in every single week with just, really like expertise about whether it's the Bureau of Prisons, whether it's like, hey, no, I don't think that the guy who everybody thought was the process server really isn't the process server down with, serving down in Florida, Rudy. People are smart. Y'all are smart and amazing. And
yeah, totally.
It's great. It's great to be part of this community.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. We'll be back in your ears next week. Gosh, now trial of the century is over. We'll be able to start talking about all the other old state cases we were trying to cover. So we'll talk about that because we've got some new hearings set for the appeal to remove Fani Willis down in Georgia. So we'll be able to talk about all that stuff on the next Cleanup on Aisle 45. I've been Allison Gill.
And I'm Pete Struck.
Cleanup on Aisle 45 is written, researched, and produced by Allison Gill, with editing by Molly Hockey. Our art and logo design are by Joelle Reeder and Moxie Design Studios, and our music is composed and performed by Adam Orr. Cleanup on Aisle 45 is a proud member of the MSW Media Network, a collection of creator-owned podcasts dedicated to news, politics, and justice. For more information, visit mswmedia.com. MSW Media.